Ngugi wa Thiong'o once said that if languages could speak, the language between them would be called translation. And you would understand why he valued translation so much, because from a certain point of his life, he wrote all his books in Gikuyu and relied on translators. But I would like to suggest that if languages could sing, they would sing a song that consists of two transitions. The first transition would be about mother tongue languages, and the second transition would focus on language as a generic system, while the leitmotif would be the importance of language in general. And I begin with a quote from Nelson Mandela. And he says, "I remember walking differently on that day. Straighter, taller, firmer." Mandela said this on occasion of the great village ceremony that was held to welcome him and his fellow circumcision school graduates. As a rite of passage from boyhood to manhood, circumcision was a critical milestone in the life of the young Nelson Mandela. And yet, the moment that was inscribed in Mandela's memory from that occasion was neither the, and I quote, 2 heifers and 4 sheep he received as gifts, nor was it even the walk that he adopted. Rather, his biggest takeaway from the occasion was a haunting memory that stayed with him for the rest of his life. And that memory was captured in a speech delivered in moving isiXhosa by the keynote speaker of the day, one Chief Meligqili, the son of Dalindyebo. When you read Mandela's moving summary of the speech of Chief Meligqili, you will obtain a very clear picture of a heartfelt speech that was not merely delivered, but performed with dexterity and the sublimity of a Shakespearean orator. And let me quote Mandela as he summarizes that speech. The chief stood up and said, "There sit our sons, young, healthy, and handsome, the flower of the Xhosa nation. We have just circumcised them in a ritual that promises them manhood. But I'm here to tell you that it is an empty, illusory promise, a promise that can never be fulfilled. For we, Xhosas and all black South Africans, are a conquered people. We are slaves in our country. We are tenants on our own soil. We have no strength, no power, no control over our own destiny in the land of our birth. These lads will go to the cities where they will live in shacks and drink cheap alcohol, all because we have no land to give them where they could prosper and multiply. They will cough their lungs out deep in the bowels of the white man's minds, destroying their health, never seeing the sun, so that the white man can have a life of unequal prosperity. Among these young men are chiefs who will never rule because they have no power to govern themselves. Soldiers who will never fight because they have no weapons to fight with. Scholars who will never teach because we have no place for them to study. The abilities, the intelligence, the promise of these young men will be squandered in their attempt to eke out a living doing the simplest, most mindless chores for the white man. These gifts they have received today are not, for we cannot give them the greatest gift of all, which is freedom and independence. End of quote, and end of summary of the speech that the young Nelson Mandela listened to. Departing from the usual sweet-talking and praise-singing speeches often delivered at such occasions, Chief Maluleke elected to call the sacred tradition of circumcision an empty promise. At that time, Mandela thought, and I quote him again, "This upstart chief was ruining my day, spoiling my proud feeling with his wrong-headed remarks," end of quote. But several years later, Mandela realized that without exactly understanding, and I'm quoting him again, why, the words of Chief Maluleke soon began to work on me. He had sown a seed, and though I let that seed lie dormant for a long season, it eventually began to grow. Later, I realized that the ignorant man that day was not the chief, but myself, end of quote. So if you ever wondered why and how Mandela learned to walk straighter, taller, and firmer, the secret is in the power of the most important message he received as a teenager, a message delivered to him in vernacular. In this case, the medium was as important as the message, as important as the messenger. Although elsewhere Mandela says that he cannot pinpoint a moment when I became politicized, to quote him, I'd like to suggest that the moment of the Chief Maluleke speech was probably the closest Mandela came to a Damascus moment. Few people were more aware of the power of indigenous languages than Mandela, perhaps alongside the likes of Ali Mazrui and Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Though difficult to find the original citation, Mandela is reported to have once said, and I quote, "If you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. If you talk to him in his language, that goes to his heart." In other words, Mandela is suggesting that there is a difference between the languages we understand and mother tongue languages. Each set has its value and its limits. Indeed, some would argue that our ability to appropriate and to function in the colonial languages is actually reliant on the hospitality of our mother tongue languages, deeply embedded in our psyches. To revert to the Mandela metaphor about a different kind of walk, I want to suggest that only mother tongue languages which walk straighter, taller, and firmer will produce citizens who walk straighter, taller, and firmer. Let's transition in this song and talk briefly about generic language. On Thursday, the 7th of December, 1993, Chloe Anthony Wofford Morrison, née Chloe Anthony Wofford, better known as Toni Morrison, delivered her acceptance speech for the Nobel Prize in Literature. But in typical Morrisonian style, she built her entire lecture around a story. And I quote her story in full, as she told it. Once upon a time, there was an old woman, blind, wise. Her reputation for wisdom is without peer and without question. Among her people, she is both the law and its transgression. The honor she is paid and the awe in which she is held reaches beyond her neighborhood to places far away, to the city where the intelligence of rural prophets is the source of much amusement. One day, the woman is visited by some young people who seem to be bent on disproving her clairvoyance and showing her up for the fraud they believe she is. Their plan is simple. They enter her house and ask the one question, the answer to which rides solely on her difference from them a difference they regard as a profound disability, her blindness. They stand before her. And one of them says, "Old woman, I hold in my hand a bird. Tell me whether it is living or dead." She does not answer. And the question is repeated. "Is this bird I'm holding living or dead?" Still, she doesn't answer. She is blind and cannot see her visitors, let alone what is in their hands. She does not know their color, gender, or homeland. She only knows their motive. The old woman's silence is so long, the young people have trouble holding their laughter. Finally, she speaks, and her voice is soft and stern. "I don't know," she says. "I don't know whether the bird you are holding is dead or alive, but what I do know is that it is in your hands. It is in your hands." End of quote and end of story. In Toni Morrison's creative hands, the meaning of the story is then interpreted in a variety of scintillating directions. Essentially, Morrison chooses, and I quote, to read the bird as language and the old woman as a practiced writer. End of quote. According to her, the old woman is anxious. I quote, about how the language she dreams in, given to her at birth, is handled and put to service. For Morrison and the old woman in the tale, language is a system and a living thing, as well as an agency, and I'm quoting from her, which is not only the ultimate measure of our lives, but has what Morrison calls midwifery properties that nourish creativity and origination. But Morrison is also aware of the dark side, abusive language and abused language. So she speaks about the numbing, and I quote, language glamorized to thrill the dissatisfied. The language, and I quote, of surveillance disguised as research. The language that maims, the language that kills, and the language that, and I quote, drinks blood, laps vulnerabilities, tucks its fascist boots upon or under crinolines of respectability and patriotism as it moves relentlessly towards the bottom line and the bottomed out mind. And she speaks of erased language, dead language, and dying languages. But here is the rub. For Morrison, and I quote, a dead language is not only one that is no longer spoken or written. A dead language is unyielding language, content to admire its own paralysis. End of quote. And such language is the language that leaves corpses of stunted intellects, retarded consciences, and diminished aesthetic sensibilities in its wake. Referencing the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, a story later to be appropriated by Ali Mazrui and Alamin Mazrui in their book, The Power of Babel, Morrison suggests that the heavens which the people of Babel were seeking to reach can in fact be accessed here and now if only we take, and I quote, the time to understand other languages, other views, and other narratives. She therefore advocates for multi rather than monolingualism. And yet, multilingualism is only possible between languages that are equal. equal in stature, equal before the law, equal in terms of the dignity with which their speakers are treated, and equal in terms of worth, spiritual worth and material worth. To conclude, let's go and stand between Toni Morrison and Chief Maluleke. Morrison does not allow the story of the blind, old, and wise woman to be a one-sided contest between an adult and capricious youngsters who are also naive. Before ending her lecture, she complicates the story. What if the youngsters were bluffing and they had no bird in their hands, she asks. What if their trick was their way of speaking of that which they wished they had but did not have? What if the youngsters were in fact crying out for someone adult to light up a torch and show them the way? What if, whether the bird in the hands of the youngsters was alive or dead, whether they had a bird or no bird in their hands, what matters is that they brought themselves into the presence of the blind, old, and wise woman. This in itself was a chance occasion not to be squandered and not to be reduced merely to a verbal boxing match. The old woman could have taken the time to know each one of them. She could have spoken to them at length and told them how she manages to see with clarity even though she was blind. Maybe when the youth demanded to be told whether the bird in their hands were dead or living, what they were really saying or expressing was the terror and the horror of going through life without a mentor and without a language with which to articulate and navigate their experiences, their feelings, their hopes, and their fears. Not to be outdone, Chief Maluleke, son of Dalindyebo, ended his devastating circumcision graduation speech on a rather ominous note. He tries to crack a dry and morose joke at which no one laughs, and I quote him, as summarized by Mandela. Maluleke says, "I have a suspicion that Kamada may in fact be dozing. If this is the case, the sooner I die, the better, because then I can meet him and shake him awake and tell him that the children of Ngubenguga, the flower of the Xhosa nation, are dying." With those words, he ends his speech. Indeed, without a living language in their hands, the children of Ngubenguga, the flower of the Xhosa nation, are dying. And so are the children of all the other nations in our country and elsewhere. They are dying in more ways than one. Will you join Chief Maluleke, son of Dalindyebo, in his effort to help the children? Won't you help me sing this song of freedom, redemption song, the song of languages that walk straighter, taller, and firmer? Thank you very much.